And we're back.
Yeah, we are. Welcome to the Bowls of Life podcast. I'm Tyler.
And I'm Virginia. As we've gone through life, we've learned something important.
Life is messy. There are a lot of armchair experts out there who will try to tell you how to make life simple.
But it's not, so you won't find any of that here. Instead, you'll find everyday people who have jumped into the mess of life and are making an adventure of it.
Speaking of everyday people, I am currently in a state of mourning right now.
Yes.
I'm mourning because the long dreaded day is drawing near. December 31st of 2020. 2020 is going to take just one more thing right before it goes out.
I know, it's like possibly the worst thing that could happen at the end of the year.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the worst.
I mean,
how would you
sure,
say?
people died, and that's tragic, and it's been a crazy year, but man, I'd argue maybe the worst is The Office leaving Netflix.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Peacock NBC streaming service, which I'm not sure if it's up yet or not. I think it is. NBC is reclaiming the rights to streaming The Office. So either you have to buy all the DVDs and find a DVD player, because
you could buy it digitally, like on Amazon, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, that's probably true. You could buy it digitally.
I've already thought through this, Tyler.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
It's like we're not buying the DVDs.
No, that'd be terrible. Or you have to get the Peacock, which, granted, there's some stuff on there. Like, I think they got Psych, which I don't even know how that happened, because that was a USA show, but they got Psych, and they've got a whole new movie coming. But even still, I don't want to pay for another streaming service. The Office. Sad stuff.
Yeah. So we've been watching it so that we can get as much of it as we can before it goes off air.
Yeah.
Off Netflix.
Yeah, because I've definitely not seen it enough in my life. I mean, the 6 complete front-to-back watch-throughs combined with the numerous random episodes I've seen here and there, it's just not enough.
It's not enough of The Office.
No.
And I'm behind you on that number, but
yeah.
But yeah, actually I was just talking to one of our friends that you guys have heard from before, Celeste Jordan, when Celeste and Josh came on. They have been watching the Christmas episodes this December. She just told me that, and I was like, that is so funny, because we're trying to watch as many as we can before it goes off of Netflix. So if you need something fun to watch this Christmas to get you in a little Christmas spirit with some good humor, The Office Christmas episodes.
Yep, unless you're listening to this episode on January 1st, 2021 or later. In which case, I guess you got to go to the Peacock to stream that.
Yeah.
Or buy it.
Yeah, so it's December 3rd. I can't believe it's December. We took a break on Thanksgiving from podcasting, and I totally missed it. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So we have been walking through a book by a guy by the name of Vaughn Roberts. The book's called The Big Picture, tracing the storyline of God's Kingdom, I believe is the subtitle to it. Yeah, and so this is episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
Maybe?
4 or 5. Let's see, there's...
No, you gotta say them out loud.
Yeah, I gotta remember them. I'm trying to remember all of the exact titles. The Pattern of the Kingdom, we had the Perished Kingdom, we had the Promised Kingdom, and this kicks off the Partial Kingdom. Here's a note on the Partial Kingdom. We're going to do a couple episodes on it. And here's why. So throughout the first 3, we've kind of seen that there's this 3-part pattern of promises that God has. So there's God's people, there's God's place, and there's God's rule and blessing. And all of those are very evident in the beginning of Scripture. You can really see them even in Genesis 1. The one you don't see there is the 4th one that we're now going to add as God's king. So there's also a promise of God's king. And so we're going to take those 4 parts and we're going to walk through the majority of the Old Testament. Pretty much all of your narrative stuff short of the prophets.
So Tyler was making notes on this episode and I was just waiting and waiting and waiting. And I was like, are you done? And he's like, this is going to be 4 episodes.
Yeah, it's going to be 4.
And I was like, haha. Really? No,
yes.
really, it's going to be 4 episodes.
Yes, it had to be. So, Vaughn Roberts covers this in one chapter. He even breaks the chapter up into 2 parts because he ends every chapter with like some Bible study questions. So he actually dropped Bible study questions in the middle of the chapter and then at the end. And it was originally planning to kind of run with that route of doing 2 parts, but just as dug into it, it just makes sense for this to be 4 parts. And
so
here's why.
We're about to spend 4 episodes on the promised kingdom, or the promise of the kingdom.
Yes, no, it's the partial kingdom.
We're about to spend...
Say it.
We're about to spend 4 episodes on the partial kingdom.
Yes, that's right. And so, here's kind of what it does. So, as we're going through here, we're going to be somewhat 30,000 feet-ish, and breaking this into each of those 4 promises that are laid out. So think of the Bible from really big picture standards. God's people, from Genesis 12 to Exodus 18, that section of the Old Testament is very focused on God's people. Now, you can find the other promises in there for sure, but if you're just thinking big picture, Genesis 12 to 18, that's God's people. God's rule and blessing, that happens big picture from Exodus 19 to Leviticus. God's place or God's land, you find that Numbers to Joshua when you're thinking, again, big picture. And then God's king, you can find Judges all the way through 2nd Chronicles. Again, big picture thoughts. You can find all the other things in there, but when you think big picture, that's kind of how that will break down. Now, this episode, we're focused on God's people, so that's Genesis 12 to Exodus 18. So we're going to talk about God's people, and we're going to talk about it in light of this promise of God's people that's made specifically to Abraham, and then it's told again to his descendants. And you find that in Genesis 12, it says, I will make you into a great nation. And again, one of those repeat times, Exodus 6, you find it says, I will take you, talking to all of the Israelites, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. And so this is a promise that God is going to find his people, and he is going to be with them. And there will be some things that kind of follow through that promise. So it starts with one guy. Who's that guy?
Father Abraham has many sons. Many sons has Father Abraham.
And what's the rest of the song? Do you
remember?
Okay, no one does. It's okay. I didn't grow up.
I know one who does.
Sure. Who's that?
Emily Martin Holyfield. If she's listening.
Yeah, I could see Emily knowing that.
You know it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
She knows it.
I believe that. Cool.
She's the one who taught it to me.
Love it.
In high school.
In high school? I mean, that feels accurate. Like, I didn't really super grow up in church or church adjacent, so I didn't know that one until much later, but I figured you would have.
No, we didn't. I don't remember that one. Anyways.
Yeah, so Father Abraham. So his life, super awesome guy. Everything went smooth because obviously he's the father of God's people and nothing ever goes wrong in his life. Right?
Yeah, no, he's perfect. He's like the ideal dude.
Yes. Yeah, so
no.
We kind of hit him a little bit in the previous episode, and we were talking about he's called out by God, he's given this promise, and so he gets called from the only place he knows, and he has to go into this land to just be a traveler, basically. He's kind of a little bit of a homeless guy.
Sojourner.
Sojourner. Of course, when I say homeless guy, I mean picture like the really, really rich RVs. And that's what I mean by homeless guy. He just doesn't have a house, but he's living well. Yeah. So, Abraham. What's his wife's name?
Well, it was Sarai.
With an I?
With an I. And then it was turned to Sarah.
With an H.
With an H.
Yeah, because you can spell Sarah without an H, but sometimes you spell it with an H. You still say it the same way, though.
Yeah.
I'm sure there was way bigger pronunciation differences in Hebrew than there are in English in those two names. But yeah. So, Sarah, Abraham, a lot of stuff going on there. They are promised to have a son, but what's the problem with them having a son?
They're like old. They're like old? Yeah.
They're
like
90s.
How old? They're 90s.
They are.
I think she's like 90 and he's like 99.
Yeah, it's something like that. I think that might be their age by the time they actually have their son. But I mean, even still, it's like 10 years younger at best.
Oh, yeah. So maybe when she was told she was going to have a son, she had still not like had any children. So she was barren.
Right, yeah. She's got no kids. Her and Abraham have never been able to have kids. So that's kind of a problem to be the father of a people. But how do they go about solving that problem, babe?
So Abraham thought he could take it into his own hands, and he took it upon himself to marry this woman that was a helper in their house named Hagar, and had a child with her, Ishmael, to be the son that God had promised him. He thought that was what he was supposed to do.
Yeah, it's a questionable move at best. I mean, Sarah was definitely involved. Seems like she looked at him and was like, "Here, take my handmaiden," and there's just some real questionable stuff going on there for sure. But God kind of looks and goes, "Yeah, that's not the son I promised you, not even a little bit." And so I don't know. There's kind of this very clear outlining here of you can try and do it. You can probably even accomplish something. But if God made you a promise and you did it in some subversive ways, that wasn't what God promised.
Right.
Like, he literally looks at Abraham and Sarah and goes, you guys are going to have a kid. And they felt that meant he was going to have a kid with Hagar, and Sarah was just kind of going to raise it as her own.
Yeah.
That wasn't clear. That wasn't the answer by any stretch of the imagination. So I think one of the principles we can kind of take right off the bat is that, think of this in terms of the gospel. I mean, if the gospel is going to be fulfilled, God has to do it. You can't do it on your own. I mean, time and time again, New Testament is very clear that, yes, your works can show what your faith is and the fact that you're saved, but your works aren't going to get you saved. Like, that's just never going to work that way.
Right. So it happens because God makes it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Sarah does eventually have a baby. A lot of time has passed. There's been some times where God has showed up and he's looked at Abraham and was like, hey, it's still going to happen. And Abraham's like, if you say so. And they've made a covenant together. We talked about some of those covenants in the previous episode. They've made these covenants. They've made these agreements. And finally, Sarah's like 90. And they have a baby.
Poor woman.
Like, can you imagine? Let's pretend they go to the hospital, right? And she rolls up and she's like, hey, I gotta head towards the labor and delivery. And they go, oh, like, your daughter's having a kid, or even your granddaughter's having a kid? And Sarah's like, no, it's me. And they just kind of look at her for a minute. Like, they look at her a little sideways.
There actually was a 7-year-old woman who had a baby. Like,
what?
I think it was in the past year. It was in the news. Yeah.
That's crazy.
How amazing. That's so cool.
Wow. Interesting.
So anyways, that would have been similar to Sarah in her situation at age 90. I mean, gosh, just having children like in your late 30s and 40s, I hear is harder. I don't know, but 90?
Yeah, that's wild. I mean, even if people are living longer at this point, they've definitely not living as long as they were in early Genesis. I mean, she laughs about it when God says that she's going to have a baby. So, I mean, it's clearly not
a normal thing.
So that's so funny. That's so weird. But, I mean, it highlights the fact that it really does take a miracle for the gospel to happen. It's not something that's natural. It's not necessarily something that makes sense. It's a miracle moment. And so now we've got Ishmael and Isaac, and technically Ishmael is the oldest of Abraham's kids. And so in that culture, the oldest, he's supposed to be the one who gets this blessing, but it doesn't go quite that way. Now, Ishmael does get some blessings, and that kind of rabbit trails into some other things, but Isaac is the one who God looks at Abraham and goes, this is the son through whom the blessing of all of these people that's ultimately going to bless the nations is supposed to come through. And then just the craziest story comes up. God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Why do you think God does that?
I don't know. I mean, you could speculate that all day long. I know a lot of people kind of say that it was a test for Abraham for his faith, which in Hebrews it does actually reference Abraham's faith because of that and many other things that, he did. It was testing Abraham. I really don't know because there were some pagan religions around this time that did child sacrifice, and that was a huge no-no. So I don't understand where God was coming from to tell Abraham to go do this.
Yeah.
So it blows my mind. I just cannot believe Abraham didn't just totally jump ship at that moment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that would have made total sense. I mean,
but it's either it's not because he didn't jump ship because he thought, okay, my kid's supposed to die. He didn't jump ship because I think he just knew God wasn't going to actually take his child's life.
Yeah, I think the way Hebrews 11 puts it is he knew, trusted that even if Isaac was to die, God could resurrect him. So, it's this trust that this is where the promise is coming from. And I wonder if some of it doesn't have to do with something that's pretty common in our culture even now, is how easily kids can kind of become an idol. Your kid can become an idol to the point to where your kids start to matter more than maybe your spouse matters, or your job, or your faith, or anything like that. It happens a lot. And so I wonder if God's not looking at Abraham and going, hey, this is who I promised that the blessing is coming through of these people, but I want you to remember who's going to bring that blessing. It's not Isaac who's going to bring the blessing of these people, or the blessing of land, or the blessing of my presence. Isaac isn't doing any of this stuff. It's me. I'm the one who's going to do all of this. And so, do you trust me more than you trust in what's going to come through Isaac?
Yeah. It's the hope is not coming through the man, it's coming through God.
Right.
And God is using the man. It's very reminiscent of the story of Hannah. And when she prayed and prayed and prayed to have a child. Mm-hmm. And she was like, if I have a child, I'm going to give him back to you, which was Samuel, right? Mm-hmm. Samuel. Yeah. And so when Samuel was born, and he was weaned, she sent him back to the church, basically, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
At that time, to serve the Lord for the rest of his life. So it's just a huge trust factor there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it kind of teaches us that if we're going to trust the gospel, we've got to trust in the promises that God gives us through the gospel, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs sacrifice. Even when following the gospel is a sacrifice, that's just part of trusting God. Now, Isaac isn't sacrificed. God doesn't have to go through the process of resurrecting him. He totally could have, but he provides a substitution. He provides the sacrifice in a ram that's caught in a thicket right near there. It always makes it sound like Abraham just kind of glances over and it's like, oh, dude, I didn't even see that ram over there. I don't know. I mean, he could have been that focused. I mean, he was pretty focused on, gosh, I really
can you imagine, Isaac laying on the altar or whatever it was and being like, Dad?
Yeah. I don't know, I think he's supposed to be around teenage years, give or take, at this point.
But it doesn't matter. His voice dropped. Dad?
Yeah, that's true. That wasn't really my focus. It's just more I'm not saying I'd win, but even as a teenager, I gotta at least put up a decent little fight against my dad to go, no, this ain't about to happen.
I was like, Dad, are you just like warming up, practicing for a sacrifice of the animal?
Well, I mean, he gosh, I don't know.
He like stops the knife like midair, right?
Like, yeah, like that's well, it's not like stab him in the face. Like you slit his throat, so
my word.
I mean, so he bleeds out, right? So like you gotta
stop.
I just that's what you do. That's how sacrifices work.
What? Okay. So, anyways,
yeah. So
there was a ram.
It's caught there, and
God provided.
Yeah, God provided it. It's a substitution, and it gets used, which is meant to kind of be a little bit of a callback to Genesis 1, but it's also a future foreshadowing, that's the word I was looking for, to Jesus. Now, we keep tracking from Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have 2 sons who turn out to be twins, but they are very, very different twins.
I always imagine like Esau to be this ginger, red-haired, covered, like he's covered in hair apparently.
Yeah, which must be weird because the Bible does not give you details very often like that, but it gives you that detail about Esau.
He hairy, okay?
Yes.
And then Jacob is like
scrawny little mama's boy.
I feel like he's just like this baby face, smooth, no beard, dark short hair, little mama's boy.
Yeah, never forget how much of a mama's boy that man was. He absolutely was. Yeah, and so Esau is born first. Now, I know they're twins, but being born first, even in twins, mattered in that culture. And so it's interesting that Jacob gets chosen, because even before they're born, Rebekah is given this promise. God speaks to her, and he says, the sons in your womb, they were going to become 2 nations. And from the very beginning, the 2 nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. God had already said this is how it's going to go down, even before the 2 were born.
Okay, and you know the story of like how one of them kicks their heel out and the midwife like ties something around the ankle to say this one came out first, but then Jacob shoots out.
Actually, that's Tamar. Different story. This one, what happens is Jacob comes out holding Esau's heel. Yes. So also a different or an interesting pregnancy or birth story, I guess.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah,
these are fun.
That's a different person. But yeah, so he comes out holding on to his brother's heel, and that's part of his name.
Representation, right? Of like, I'm ahead of you.
Yeah, and so he's holding on to him. He's like, "Hey, I still got you, bruh. You ain't going nowhere unless I'm there." I don't know. And so he gets named Jacob, and Jacob means deceiver, which just can't be the best name. Like, I'm hoping it gets the name later, like the meaning later.
I don't know how names work in the Bible, but they
have meaning.
Meaning, yeah.
Yeah, they definitely have meaning. Yeah, so he lives up to his name in just every step of the way. That dude lives up to it. Do you know the story of the bowl of stew? You familiar with it? Tell me a little bit about it. Esau
comes in one day and is like famished and starving, and the little mama's boy's in the kitchen and making stew.
Lentil stew, I think.
Lentil stew. Lentil's that's probably a very good dish there. And Esau's like, dude, feed me. And Jacob's like, I will give you stew if you give me your birthright. And he's so hungry that he agrees to it.
What? That is... You get the larger majority, like 75% of the inheritance when dad dies is the birthright, along with some blessings and stuff, but that's the majority thing.
I wonder if Esau just felt like, sure, man, like, whatever, just feed me, okay? I'll beat you up for my birthright later. Like, that's probably what went through his head.
I don't know, man. I'm curious, like, how does Jacob manage to try and keep that thing? Because... yeah, I got questions I don't have answers to there. But yeah, so he's kind of being a little tricky there, but whatevs. Well, then, Isaac is older. Apparently, he's started to go blind, and he's feeling like I might die soon.
He's on his deathbed.
Yeah.
And Rebecca tells Jacob,
So Isaac tells Esau, he's like, hey, go out, hunt me some wild game, because he loves to eat wild game. That's why Esau's his favorite, not Jacob.
All the game wild?
No, you got livestock you take care of. That's true. But no, he wants that stuff in the wild. He had to catch it with the bow and the arrow or like a spear or something.
Whatever, Esau just tackled that thing.
He probably did. He's both quick and big. He's that guy. Yeah. I believe it. But yeah, he's like, give me some of that game, bring it here, and I'm gonna give you the blessing of the firstborn son. It's not the inheritance, but it's this blessing. Whatever. That's where Rebecca starts coming in.
I don't ever understand the blessing because I'm like, you just said something. Like, you could say it again or you could say it differently.
I think it's supposed to be a representation of God blessing them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe it's Holy Spirit led.
Yes. We can roll with that. But yeah, so Rebecca rolls up because she's kind of overhearing it. I guess she's either in the room or she's around the corner listening. I don't know. But she runs to Jacob because Jacob's her favorite. Remember, he's a mama's boy, so obviously her favorite. And she's like, hey, you need that blessing. Here's what we're going to do. Your brother's hairy? Don't worry. Your dad won't know. I'm going to take some goat skin and kind of cover you all up in this goat skin.
That's how hairy Esau was.
That's crazy. Like, I got some arm hair, but it isn't goat hair thick.
Yeah, he was apparently really hairy. But yeah, she told Jacob to pretend to be Esau. Mm-hmm. And he goes in with some food.
Yeah, I think they killed like a lamb or something.
Yeah, like pretending it's wild game. And he pretends to be Esau, and Isaac gives Jacob Esau's blessing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and believe it or not, when Esau rolls up a bit later, he's like, hey, Dad, killed some wild game with my bare hands, did it all with my hands, didn't use a knife or anything to skin it, because I'm a manly man. Time for that blessing. And Isaac's like, bruh, I just blessed you. But he hadn't. And so he gives him another blessing, and it's basically, you're going to work real hard, and you're going to be under your brother's foot for a while, but you'll eventually break out and do your own thing. It's not the best blessing.
Yeah, it's like secondhand.
Yeah. So, Esau's pretty cross about all that, believe it or not. He has now been cheated out of his birthright and his blessing of the firstborn, and so he starts telling everybody, I'm going to kill my brother. Like, kill him dead, so that I get the inheritance and whatever about his blessing. And so, Jacob runs, as he should, runs away. He runs to his mother's brother, his uncle, Laban, and he lives there with Laban. Laban's like, yeah, come in, live in the household. It's cool. I love that you're here. But on his way there, something really interesting happens. He goes to sleep one night, and he apparently lays his head down on a rock. It just doesn't feel comfortable. But whatever, you lay down on a rock, that's fine. So while he's laying down on this rock, he falls asleep. He dreams of this basically ladder or stairway going up to heaven. And so angels are coming up and down this thing, and at the top of it is God, and God speaks to him, and he tells him essentially the same thing that Abraham was told, like, hey, through you there's going to be a people that are my people. I'm going to give you a land that's the land that it's a promised land. It's going to be this great holy land, and you will be blessed through me. So he renews the promise that he gave to Abraham, that he gave to Isaac, and now he has renewed it to Jacob. So Jacob, he gets to Laban's house, and he sees Rachel. Laban's got two daughters, Rachel and Leah. Leah is the older sister. Rachel's the younger sister. And he sees her, and he, immediately falls in love. It's love at first sight. Or at the very least, it's lust at first sight. Unclear. But he thinks she's pretty, and he says, you know what? I want to marry her, and I'm willing to work. I think it's 7 years. That's just crazy. That man worked 7 years of hard labor to get to marry her. How'd that go, babe?
Well, on the night of his wedding, he looks up and there's Leah.
Yeah, he looked up a little late, though. Some things had happened. He was a little toasted, a little bit in the wind, and she was probably wearing like a veil, and he didn't know who was who.
That's so crazy. But yeah, Leah, he ended up marrying Leah because she was the firstborn daughter, and she's supposed to marry first.
Yep. And so Laban's like, oh man, no big deal. Look, you just work another 7 years for me, but don't worry about having to wait 7 more years to marry Rachel. Once the time of wedding kind of thing is over with Leah, you just immediately go ahead and marry Rachel too. And that's like a couple of weeks or a month or something like that. So like a month later, he gets to marry Rachel, but he does still have to work for 7 more years too.
I thought he had to work 7 years before he could marry her.
No, he got to marry her there. And it's interesting. There's this phrase when it refers to Leah. It talks about she had weak eyes, and it is very unclear what weak eyes means, but it is at least interpretive. Implies? Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. It implies that, he just didn't have a thing for Leah. He didn't really seem to love her. He wasn't attracted to her. He didn't love her. But now he's married to these 2 sisters. And that can't possibly cause any kind of tension or make anything go wrong.
Yeah, that never works.
Yeah, nope.
Even if you're not sisters.
Nope.
Pretty sure it would never work.
Nope.
But Leah has all the children.
She does. She has several kids, and then Rachel can't have kids, and so she has her not her concubine. She has her maidservant essentially sleep with Jacob so that she can have kids vicariously through the maidservant, and then Leah stopped having kids, so she does the same thing with her maidservant, and eventually Rachel will have some kids, and by the time it's all said and done, he has 12 sons and 1 listed daughter. I'd be willing to bet there were probably more daughters, but this one mattered for one particular story, so they list her. But yeah, he ends up having a lot of kids between 4 women.
3 each. Not really, but
no.
Average.
Yeah. And so he has a lot of kids. Through all of that, he's spending a lot of time. He grows Laban's flock, but Laban keeps changing what he's paying Jacob, essentially. And so he eventually gets fed up with the fact that he spent his childhood, teenage years being the deceiver against his brother, and now Laban is being the deceiver against Jacob. He's getting a taste of his own medicine, and so he eventually looks at his wives and goes, all right, look, I've worked long and hard for your dad, and he has done nothing but try to rip me off, so we're going to pack up, and we're going to dip out. And they do it basically in the middle of the night. And so he runs off. Laban kind of catches back up with him. There's this whole interchange. But he eventually leaves from Laban. And he starts heading back towards his brother Esau. Guess maybe after all these years, he's kind of thinking, I should reconcile with my brother. So he starts heading towards his brother. And he sends some guys, some of his servants in front of him to go give his brother a heads up. Like, hey, Jacob's going to come. And I think the hope is Esau will hear it and be like, man, I ain't seen my brother in like 15, 20 years, something crazy. I'm kind of excited to see him. But when his servant comes back, he hears that Esau grabbed up all of his mighty men and starts heading towards Jacob. And so now he's freaking out. Rightfully so, because he cheated his brother out of some things, and his brother has reasons to be angry. And so he splits up his family. This is horrible. He splits up his family based on who he likes the most. So he sends his Leah's maidservant and
who he likes the least.
Yeah, who he likes the least. So sends Leah's maidservant and her kids first, so that if they run into Esau and Esau slaughters the whole camp, at least it was the maidservant and the kids I like the least. And then he sends Leah and her kids. And, at least it was the kids I like the second least if they get slaughtered. Then he sends Rachel's maidservant and her kids. I did kind of somewhat like them, but not a ton. And he figures, what's those 3? If they all manage to get slaughtered, surely by then Rachel and those kids will have gotten word and they'll turn back. But he sends them. But you know what that dude does? he stays back by himself, just in case. He sends everybody in front of him, and he stays at the very back of the line.
Do you think it was really because it was selfish motives, or was it like he was sending them first to buffer?
I think it was a little of both. He sends a lot of animals and stuff to his gifts to his brother as well, and so he's kind of trying to appease his brother a little bit. I don't think he sent them expecting his brother to slaughter women and children. But
yeah, because I would think he felt like Esau's coming to kill him.
Right.
He's not actually going to kill the women and children.
Yep. That's the hope. That's the most positive reading.
Right. You just want to go to the darkest.
Man, I don't know. I assume people are the worst.
Yeah.
And they often are. But while everybody's gone and separated, this angelic, possibly God being turns up and gets in a wrestling match with Jacob, and they apparently wrestle all night, which is just impressive.
Yeah.
To wrestle that long, and eventually it kind of reaches daybreak, and for some reason this angelic, potentially God person is
Is it an angel of the Lord?
Yeah, and it's one of those times where it could be angel of the Lord, could be incarnate Jesus.
Right, but
unclear.
Yeah, so it's either angel or it's Jesus.
Yeah. And so he's like, hey, it's time to let me go. Sun's coming up. And Jacob's like, no, I got you. I'm not letting you go until you bless me. And then he just touches the angel of the Lord, touches his hip socket, pops it out of socket. But it's just gotta be the worst. I mean, your whole leg doesn't work right anymore, right? I mean, that's what the hip does.
Something like that.
It makes your leg bend. I don't know. I didn't take anatomy and physiology. I don't know anything about the human body. But yeah, so he gets renamed in this process Israel, which means one who strives with God. He gets across this river that he's been behind, and he finally runs into his brother. And Esau, he's forgiven him. He's not worried about it. He's not sweating any of the details. And he's just glad to see his brother.
He's had a change of heart.
He's had a change of heart. It's really interesting. We don't really get to learn anything about what went on in Esau's life. We don't really know what happens in Esau's life post this, other than he has a lot of kids that eventually become a nation. But yeah, he's had a change of heart. But here's the thing I think Jacob's story is really meant to highlight. And it's that God doesn't choose people based on merit. Because Jacob's kind of the worst. He's not the greatest guy. I think some things in life kind of makes him become a better person for sure. But God had already chosen him long before that. I mean, he's literally in his mom's womb when Rebecca gets that promise that the older is going to serve the younger.
Mm-hmm.
God doesn't choose people based on their merit, based on their actions. It's just God's grace. It's His sovereign grace that doesn't earn us, that gifts us salvation. Cool. We're going to take a little bit of break, and then we'll hop back into this big story.
Okay, so like we said, Jacob, who is now known as Israel, he's made peace with his brother, he's living his life, and he has 12 sons. Joseph is his second to youngest son, and also the favorite.
Yeah, he's Rachel's first naturally born kid. And I guess he gets to spend some time with Rachel, and then Benjamin really doesn't because she dies in childbirth. So maybe that's why he's the favorite. I don't know.
Probably so. But Benjamin was the second favorite.
Right. He somewhat blames him for Rachel's death, but not a lot.
But Joseph is the favorite.
One.
He's Rachel's son. And because he's the favorite and likes to rub it in his brother's faces.
He does.
They sell him into slavery.
Suck.
Yeah, they were going to kill him, but one of them, was like, nah, let's just, let's just sell him into slavery and just, like, get him out of our life.
What a horrible way to go.
So he goes through slavery. He gets sent to prison. I don't even know why he gets sent to prison.
Because of Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife is all like, "Hey, come sleep with me." And
so while he's a slave?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's a slave, working in Potiphar's house.
He's worked his way up, so he's pretty respected.
And Potiphar, who is a
government official in Egypt.
Right. His wife wants Joseph, and Joseph like, is
nah.
like, I ain't doing that. I know what's going to happen if I do that, or if I even pretend or even think about doing that.
Right.
And she accuses him of
doing it anyway.
Of raping her, and he gets sent to prison. And while he's in prison, he's just living out his life in prison. He actually interprets a dream for somebody, and that gets word around. To where the Pharaoh... Is it Pharaoh?
Yeah, so he interprets a cupbearer of the Pharaoh's dream, and when he kind of gets restored to his position, he's supposed to tell the guy, "Oh man, there's this Joseph guy." He doesn't say anything to Pharaoh for a couple of years.
Yeah, Joseph's forgotten about being the interpreter.
Yep, but then Pharaoh has a dream.
And needs to know how to interpret it. And so the cupbearer's like, "Oh yeah, this guy in prison interpreted a dream and it was right, so let's go get him." So they call in Joseph, and he interprets the dream, and basically it's like telling the future of famine and what they need to do, just like what's going to be happening in the future. And Joseph helps the Pharaoh make a plan for the famine.
Mm-hmm.
And so he ends up getting a really high position and ends up like leading that nation of Egypt, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's some theories that it might be like small little sub-nations of Egypt,
sure,
but
it's probably
Egypt.
Not like full on Egypt.
Yeah, just go with Egypt.
So he's a leader in this area, and while he's, overseeing the... I always just imagine it, and maybe this is because of a movie I watched, but like he's at this market.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this is the Bible kind of also gives us the setting, but he's like at this market, and like he's basically just like supervising them, giving out food, or not really giving out. I guess you come and pay for it, you buy it, but
right.
His brothers show up to get some food to prepare for the famine.
Right. Well, they're in the middle of the famine. They've now run out of food, basically, and that's why they had to roll all the way to Egypt from Canaan, is because there was no food anywhere else except Egypt, where Joseph had been setting up for the past couple of years for this.
Right. So they're in the famine. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so they're in the famine, and because of Joseph, they have food. So that's why they have to come and get food from Joseph in Egypt. Mm-hmm. So his brothers show up, and at first he kind of like plays it off like, I don't know them, I'm not going to let them see me or realize who I am. And this whole thing goes down. Tell us.
Yeah, so they get there, and they're like, oh, he accuses them of being spies, and they're like, no, we're just all the sons of this one guy. There used to be 12 of us. But one of us died, and the other one's still at home. That's Benjamin. He's still at home. So there's just 10 of us here. Well, he accuses them of being spies and says, I'm not going to trust that you guys are who you say you are unless you bring that 11th son back with you. So that he keeps Simeon in jail, in prison. That's messed up. I don't know why he picked Simeon, but he did. And then sends the other 9 of them back home. Well, they go home. Dad's all mad. Jacob's like, what the heck? Y'all lost another one of my sons? What are you doing? And they're like, yeah, but we can get him back if you'll just let us take Benjamin the next time we need to go buy food anyway. And he goes, nah, that is my one natural-born kid by Rachel that is still alive. Y'all let Joseph get killed out there in the wilderness, so no, ain't gonna happen. And so eventually they run out of food, and Benjamin's got to go. Like, he's just gotta go, or they gonna starve to death. And so, they go. They get there. They go through this whole exchange with him again. They start to leave, and unbeknownst to them,
Joseph like slipped this expensive like cup or something into their bag.
Yep.
Or some coins.
So some coins in the first trip. This time there's more money, but there's specifically his cup is in Benjamin's. And I think it was Reuben or Judah. One of the two was like, look, if that cup is in anybody's bag, you take that person and you just kill them. And then they opened up Benjamin's bag and I was like, oh, snap. This isn't good. That's the one of us that Dad was like, he has to come back.
If there ever was a foot and mouth situation, it was then. And the older brother was like, dang, why did I say that?
And so they bring them all back to the place, and he's like, look, the rest of y'all can go, but I'm keeping this Benjamin with me. Now, this whole time, he hasn't spoken in Hebrew, and so he's only spoken in Egyptian, so they don't even know that he understands when they talk to each other. But so he's like, nah, I'm just going to keep this one. The rest of y'all go on home. Get out. And I think this is a bit of a test to just kind of see, are y'all going to do the same thing y'all did to me, to Benjamin? Y'all just going to leave him here? And they are like, look, you just keep me, like, I'll go in his place. I'm pretty sure this was Judah. It's like, I'll stay here in his place. You just send all of the rest of them back. And it's at that point that Joseph's finally like, hey, I'm Joseph. Nice to see you guys again. And I can only imagine, like, they just sit there for a minute. Like, it's one of those dumbfounded sitcom moments where everybody just sits there and stares. It's like, what?
How did they not recognize him?
I don't know.
It's like the whole Clark Kent and his glasses thing.
It's been like 20 years. You don't have pictures. He grew a beard.
Sure.
He got older.
Yes.
Maybe he's a little more tan. He's wearing really nice clothes.
He's probably wearing like the Egyptian cotton.
He's got the Egyptian eye makeup going on too.
And the pharaoh hat.
Yeah, and so there's just all these things happening. But yeah, I mean, I don't know.
So anyways, they reunite. They're all good. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, Joseph says. And he moves his whole family into Egypt with him.
Yep. Which is a great thing in that time, in that moment, because, I mean, the famine is still continuing. They're only like a year or two into the famine. They still got a couple more to go, so they're where the food is. Man, Pharaoh's like, oh, Joseph, you got a family? Heck yeah, let them live on my dime, basically. And so they get there, and they thrive. Man, they all start having kids, and their kids are having kids, and a couple generations pass, and there's a ton of people that have come from Israel. They are now they are the Israelites. And they're a people group. But some generations have passed. Some new people have come to become Pharaoh. People who could give a rip about who Joseph is or who Joseph was, because he's dead by now. And so they go, yeah, we need some people to build some stuff around here, and let's enslave the Israelite guys that are hanging out on the edge of town. And so they enslaved them.
That's so crazy. Like, that, I mean, I hadn't really thought about it like that, but the Israelites were literally the descendants of Jacob, known as Israel. So years later, the new government in town, which is like years later,
right,
is literally wow.
Yeah.
Like, picks out the Israelites, the descendants of Israel, and is like, you will be our slaves.
Yeah, we call that racism.
That's exactly what it is.
Yes. That's 100% what it is. And so for about
Did they look different?
Apparently. I don't know.
Wow.
They look different enough to be noticeable.
Goodness.
Yep.
Yeah, because you would, like, they knew. They had
to.
A different people. It's not like...
Yeah.
Gosh.
Yep.
Never really thought about how it was literally just the descendants of Israel, but how many it was at that point, too.
Absolutely. Now, there are definitely some Egyptian slaves as well, but they enslave an entire people group. And 400 years of slavery passes.
Wow.
400 years. And during that 400 years, they continue to grow. Like, part of the point of enslaving them was, hey, we don't want them to get too big. But actually, in the middle of being enslaved, they grew like exponentially more. irony of ironies. And so
well, them Hebrew women, they were good at birthing babies.
So, yeah. And
we'll get to that when we get to Moses.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's where we're at this point. So Pharaoh, probably a different Pharaoh, definitely a different Pharaoh, a couple of Pharaohs, after one who enslaved them, he goes, look, there's too many daggum Israelites, they're growing, and if anybody comes to attack us, they're just going to rebel against us because we have enslaved them, and they'll fight against us, which, makes sense. And so he's like, this is what you want, what all the midwives, they're Egyptian women who serve as midwives for the Israelite Hebrew slaves, and so he looks at them and goes, every time a baby's born, I want you to look at it, tell me if it's a boy or girl, and if it's a boy, I'm going to need you to kill it.
That's terrible.
I mean, I don't know why he thought they were going to do that in the first place. They're midwives.
They're midwives.
They're there for life. Like, that's their thing. They're about life. They want the new life to happen.
They are bringing life into the world.
Right, but
that's their job.
Yeah.
And he's now telling them to kill the babies.
Yeah, so not sure exactly how it all went down, but basically they keep having babies and the midwives are like, the Hebrew women just pop them out before we can get there.
Yeah, they're literally like, those Hebrew women just have those babies before we even get in the room to deliver them. And
so by the time they're like in the husband's arm, what are we supposed to do? Fight him for it? Like, yeah, and so they keep having babies, and he's like, look, somebody's going to kill them babies. And then there's this one that's born. What's that one's name?
His mom thought he was beautiful.
Yeah, she did.
And she named him Moses.
And I have no idea what Moses means, but maybe it means beautiful or something like that.
I don't know what it means, but I just remember, I remember reading it, and it says something about,
he was such a good-looking little baby.
The mom just looked on him and was like, what a I don't know, you're so beautiful.
I imagine there's some undertones of, I felt that you are blessed by God kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so she hides the baby.
Yeah, she puts him in a Moses basket.
She hides him first in the house and kind of keeps him for a little while until she felt like she couldn't do that anymore. And then she puts him in a Moses basket. As our Australian friends would say.
Well, that's what, yeah.
It's a basket.
It's a basket that Moses was in. It's a Moses basket.
Yes.
And floats down the river and just happens upon Pharaoh's daughter.
Yep, so here's the thing.
She knew that was going to happen. She did that
on purpose. Well, he didn't even float down the river. She sets him in the reeds. He sits in the reeds, not tosses him out in the middle. You've been watching the animated movie too much where he floats past the crocodile in the raging waters. Nah, he just got set in the reeds, and then Pharaoh's daughter comes up, and sister's standing there watching all of this. She puts him where Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe on purpose. And then Pharaoh's daughter's like, oh, somebody was going to drown their baby because he was a boy and he's an Israelite and that's what they have to do. And she was like, I'm going to raise this kid.
She thought he was beautiful too.
She did. She's like, I'm going to raise this. He's going to be my baby. And then his sister rolls up and is like, hey, I can find you a wet nurse for that baby since, he's got to eat something and you're not producing milk. And you know who she goes to get to wet nurse and take care of that baby for at least another year or two?
His mama.
His mama. That woman was without him for 30 minutes.
She was like, that played out really nicely.
Oh my gosh. That was all the plan.
That was all God.
And then once he gets old enough to be weaned, he goes and lives in Pharaoh's palace as Pharaoh's daughter's kid, basically.
Yeah, but obviously he's different.
Yep.
Again, I don't know what they look like, but obviously, as an Israelite, he looked different than the Egyptians.
Yes.
So he was raised as Pharaoh, as a child of the family of Pharaoh, whatever.
Yep.
And he starts to notice that his people that are like him are enslaved.
And he thinks to himself, that feels a little sketch.
That's wrong.
Yep.
So one day, Moses actually sees an Israelite getting beaten by Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
And he acts out because it angers him.
Yeah.
And he kills the Egyptians.
Yep. It seems to be one Egyptian, and it kind of seems like he even followed the guy like around the corner, kind of thing.
Yeah, like he
premeditated. Yeah, he thought about it, and he ends up killing this guy, hides the body, and then another day shows up, and some Israelites are arguing, and he's like, "Hey guys, don't argue. You're the same people," and they're like, "You gonna kill us too?"
Yeah. They saw him. Yeah,
somebody knew something and word had gotten out. And so he did the only logical thing he could do.
He ran away.
He went and lived in the desert, ended up getting married, had some kids, and he works as a shepherd. And while he's working as a shepherd, something real crazy happens. What happens?
He sees a burning bush.
Well, a bush that's on fire is not that crazy. Why is this bush crazy?
Well, the bush wasn't actually burning.
It was
just on fire.
But it's not burning up. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. Is it still green, but there's
like
flames?
the CGI effects on TV?
Yeah, above it. I don't know. It's weird. But yeah, so...
where there's fire and nothing's burning.
It's weird, and he rocks up, and he's like, "This is strange. I'm going to take my shoes off." Something strange about this. Does God tell him to take his shoes off? I don't remember.
I don't know, but apparently
he
knew it was holy ground, so he took his shoes off.
Yep, and he meets with God, and God's like, "Hey, you're going to lead the Israelite people out." And there's a whole interaction there, but he asks God, he's like, who am I supposed to tell the people has sent me? And he says...
I am.
Who I am. He says, tell them I am sent you. And... it's I am who I am, or I will be what I will be. It's YHWH. There's no vowels in there, so you can't pronounce it. But it's essentially it's God. Like, I am who I am. You know, it kind of gives you this idea.
Can you explain the YHWH? You didn't.
Yes, it's spelled YHWH. In Hebrew, there's no consonants there's no vowels in there so that you can't verbally pronounce the word because it's that holy of a thing for the Hebrew people. There's a whole rabbit trail you can chase with it. But yeah, like this name, I am who I am, or I'll be what I will be, like it starts to come to this idea that you can't just name God, like, because there's no name that really fully captures or encapsulates his character. Instead, you just gotta watch who he is and and how he acts on behalf of his people to really understand who he is. Because in the Bible, names are meant to represent who you are, and there's just no name that fully represents who God is. And I mean, that's a thing to remember when you're reading the Bible, really, is we tend to act really quickly and going, all right, I read this, now what's the application for me? Like, what's it supposed to say to me? When really the first thing we should usually ask is, what does this tell me about God? Because the Bible is a story about God's salvation, but it's also a story revealing who God is. And when we ask, what's this tell me about God? Application will naturally start to come after that. But yeah, so the story kind of continues. So Moses eventually rolls into Egypt with his brother Aaron, and he looks at Pharaoh and's like, hey, God said, let my people go so that we can go worship him. And Pharaoh's like, no. And so there's this time of plagues where God starts to prove who he is. I've always read this as like 10 days. But I don't think that feels even remotely accurate. I don't even think it's 10 weeks. I suspect it's like multiple months. It's just 10
seasons.
Yeah, like, it might have been longer than a year.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
I can see it being long times.
Yeah, because for the way this happens is like, Plague 1, water to blood. So water to blood happens, Pharaoh's like, hey, make it go away, so he makes it go away, and he's like, oh, I told you could leave, but you can't leave. And then I feel like a long enough time has to pass for him to not just go, oh, no, if he said they're about to send frogs on the land, that's going to happen. So a little time has to pass for him to kind of shake off, like, water to blood, whatever. And then it's like, oh, well, here's a ton of frogs just everywhere. There are literally frogs in your bed. You cannot get away from frogs. They're everywhere. That sounds horrible. But then he's like, all right, I'll let you go. Just make the frogs go away. But then he doesn't let them go. And then God's like, all right, well, I'm going to send, sometimes we call it lice, sometimes it's gnats, but either way, it's this very small, super annoying bug. And so I'm going to send lice and gnats. And then that happens. And then the next one's flies, or it might actually be wild animals. It's some kind of swarm of things that's capable of harming livestock. But either way, he sends that, and then he makes it go away, but he doesn't let them go. And then there's this pestilence or a plague on the livestock that kill off the livestock. Well, that one goes away. And then there's boils on the humans and the animals. Everybody got boils all over their body. It just sounds miserable. And then there's this thunderstorm of hail and maybe even some fire too. And he's like, oh, y'all can make it stop. Y'all can go. But he doesn't let them go. And then there's locusts, and they eat up all the plant life. So now all the animals are dead and all the plants are dead. So what are you even going to eat anymore? And then there's darkness for 3 days, which just sounds horrible.
And no sunlight?
No sunlight. It's not like it's a real cloudy day. Like, it's literally nighttime for a complete, 72 hours. Just to prove that, hey, I am God, and I can do whatever the heck I want. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't convince him deeply enough. And thus comes the last of the plagues. The death of the firstborn, a.k.a. the Passover. And so when the Passover is about to happen, God instructs Moses to tell the Israelite people that they have to sacrifice an unblemished lamb, that they have to put that blood over their doorpost, and then there's a certain way they're supposed to prepare it as a meal that night. And during that night, the angel of the Lord, potentially angel of death, essentially, is going to pass through, and every firstborn son in any house that doesn't have the blood over the doorpost is going to die. And that would include Israelites who chose not to do that. Mm-hmm. And this act of deliverance for the Israelites through this sacrificial lamb, it teaches the Israelites an important principle. That God saves by substituting something for what deserves it. Because this angel has been given a task of every firstborn. And so a firstborn lamb that's unblemished has to take the place of the firstborn of the household. There's a substitution that's happened. There's a substitution that happened for Isaac in a ram caught in a thicket. And there was a substitution that happened for Adam and Eve for a lamb, a goat, a sheep, for them to have clothing to cover up their shame. Substitution has to happen. That's how God saves. So this Passover is a shadow of a much greater act of deliverance. And that's Jesus' death on a cross. His death on a cross is an act of substitution for us. Because sin deserves punishment, and the punishment for sin is death. So the only way to save the people who are due that death is for a death to be paid by someone else who doesn't owe that same thing. That lamb was a firstborn that wouldn't have had to pay that price. Jesus didn't have to pay that price because he had no sin, thus he didn't deserve the punishment of it. There was a substitution. And so the story continues for the Israelite people. They leave. They've finally been allowed to leave Egypt. And so they're traveling. They're headed towards, supposed to be Mount Sinai, but they're really not going in a very direct way to get there. But God's leading, and there's a reason the way He leads them. He leads them in a direction of the Red Sea, or it might actually better be translated the Reed Sea, but we all call it the Red Sea, so we'll go with Red Sea. And so he's heading towards the Red Sea, and as they head in that direction, Pharaoh goes, "Oh, snap. Who's going to do all the work around here? I ain't got enough money to pay people to do what I had all those Israelite people doing." So he sends the army to go back and get them. Because somebody's got to work, and it ain't going to be him. And they chase after them, and the Israelite people look back, and here comes the army behind them, and there's the Red Sea in front of them, and they got nowhere to go. And God says to Moses, "Stick your staff in the water," and it parts. And that in and of itself is a miracle. But then they step into the water, or they step into the part, and the ground is dry. And that's a miracle. And then as they continue to travel through, and apparently it's a decent distance because they travel all the way through the night, as they're traveling through and the Egyptian army is chasing behind them, but not catching them. Just saying, they can't keep up even though they're on chariots. It's kind of interesting. You know why they can't keep up? Because the ground isn't dry anymore. It's now started turning to mud, so that the chariot wheels and the horses and the people themselves are getting stuck and they can't traverse through there. And then God, once the Israelite people are all out, closes the water back up, and the Egyptian army is conquered without the Israelites ever lifting a finger. And this act of deliverance teaches the Israelites another important principle. God saves by conquest. See, the Red Sea is a shadow of a greater act of deliverance, and it's Jesus' resurrection. See, his resurrection is a conquest of death. Jesus takes the place of sin. He substitutes himself for the punishment of sin for us, and takes that punishment of sin, which is death, but then he conquers death without us ever lifting a finger. Because we're not capable of conquering death. The Israelites were not capable of defeating the Egyptian army, but God defeated them in their place. He did it for them, the same way Jesus defeats death for us. Through God's act of salvation for Israel, the people promise is now fulfilled, but it's only partially fulfilled. Because what we'll see as the Israelites continue to live, even before they make it to the promised land, we'll see that their hearts just don't fully belong to him. But that people promise that God has a special people has now been partially fulfilled. He now has this people group that are his people. But the story isn't over. See, God's not just a God who saves. He's also a God, he demands and he draws near. And he demands and he draws near because he wants to bless people. And so in the next episode of the Partial Kingdom, we're going to dig into God's rule and his blessing.
Wow. So learning about God's people, knowing the end of the story, knowing that he has these people in order to redeem and bless all people. This has been a cool journey so far, just learning about that.
Absolutely.
And excited to learn about God's rule and blessing in the next episode. But what you can do for us now is, until the next episode, you can subscribe to our podcast so that you don't miss an episode that come out every Friday. You can share it on social media or by word of mouth with your friends. Give us a rate and review. We'll take 5 stars and nice words. And also, you know, any feedback if you have something particular you want to hear about. And then also go to anchor.fm/bowlsoflife and record for us what is messy in your life that you were loving, and we would love to feature you on the podcast episodes. Thanks for hanging out with us. We are glad you are hanging in here with all this great information. We hope to see you next time.